you've been alive, I would imagine, Max.
Yes. I'm just 19 years old, so definitely more than I was alive. So, yeah, maybe let's start by talking about who you are and what you do. Just tell us where you're from. Tell us where you're from.
Well, I grew up in Scotland, although I now live in England. I went to medicine at Aberdeen University and then trained in general practice. I think it's family practice in Germany. And I now live in Macclesfield. Got a couple of children. My daughter's doing medicine at the moment. She's a junior doctor in a local hospital. And my interest, so to an extent, I suppose the reason I'm speaking to you is I've been interested in heart disease for far too long. I've been studying it on and off for many, many years, and I came to the conclusion that the ideas, the standard ideas about heart disease are just wrong, basically. Of
So,
course,
so yeah. Well, one question would be, where does that interest come from initially? Because, you know, I'm also a medical student right now, and it's a very interesting field of so many different topics that you can be interested in, and there's like so much to discover. And why exactly did you choose to go down that path of looking further into heart disease and the actual, the one thing that distinguishes you, in my estimation, from the other people that I've been listening to, in terms of, the whole cholesterol thing and heart disease and etc., all that, was that you actually tried to show and to find out what the actual pathophysiology is and what exactly happens inside of the artery, as opposed to just saying, here's a study, and that's what we think. You'd be like, okay, what actually is going on? And so that's a completely different approach than just being critical of the narrative and trying to combat it with studies that show the opposite. I mean, everyone can do that, but actually take on the challenge of finding out what actually is going on is a whole different level.
yeah. When I was in Scotland doing at university, Scotland had the highest rate of heart disease in the world. Well, whether it did or not, the figures are always a bit difficult to be sure about, but it was very, very high. I mean, it was almost part of the background. Men, mainly men, arrived at hospital having heart attacks and died.
Yeah.
Over a 10-year period, 1 in 10 men in Scotland would be dead from a heart attack or cardiovascular disease in general. So it was quite a major issue, and I just accepted when you're at medical school, you accept what you're told. There's a lot of stuff to learn. You can't question everything, and but I'd been to France a few times, and I looked at what they ate, and I thought, these people don't have a low saturated fat diet. These people have a really high saturated fat diet,
Yeah.
and they smoke more than we did in Scotland. And in fact, I started looking at it, and it was clear that if you looked at the risk factors, the classical risk factors for heart disease in France, they should have been getting slightly more heart disease than Scottish men. Not a huge amount, maybe 10-20% more, but they were getting only 20%, 1/5. So I thought, well, the idea that that diet is causing this. And then, as I wrote my book, I actually had a lecturer, a female cardiologist, who was also a researcher, called Elspeth Smith, who, in one meeting, one small group tutorial, mentioned, she said to me and the rest of us, the LDL, which is what people normally call cholesterol, low density lipoprotein, cannot get through the endothelium.
And so which year was that?
That would be 1982.
1980 something. Okay, but 1980 something, you learned basically. Were you in medical school that time, or was it
Yeah.
afterwards? So you were in medical school, and um, the teacher or whoever was giving that lecture told you that LDL cannot cross the endothelial barrier, the
Yes.
endothelial layer, and so still, how then did it establish so eminently and firmly across the entire field of cardiology and generally across medicine that this is exactly the process that is going on, that LDL somehow does cross in the end, does cross the endothelial layer and ends up in the artery wall and accumulates there. If we apparently knew that already in the 1980s.
Well, some people knew that. About two, maybe.
Okay.
Her and me.
I see.
She wrote quite a lot about it. I think that because basically the hypothesis was very straightforward. You eat too much cholesterol. Cholesterol gets into your bloodstream, it's then absorbed into your artery walls, and because the what they call the lesions, the plaques that build up in your arteries that narrow them, were purported to have cholesterol in them, then it seemed very simple. Well, where else can it come from? How else can it happen? So I think it was a thinking process of well, it must be that because we can't think of anything else. You know, they discovered cholesterol, inverted commas, in artery walls. They said that people who had high cholesterol levels were more likely to get heart disease. And so people just made this assumption, well, it has to do that. Because that's what we don't need to see a process. We don't need to actually look and see, can this actually happen? Because it is happening. So therefore it must happen.
Okay, so tell us why this is not possible. So why do you say LDL cannot cross the endothelium? Because this is what the entire mainstream hypothesis is actually based on. You might make the argument so that LDL crosses the endothelium. What we have been recently, I had actually a lecture on that, and it became a bit more nuanced than I actually expected in the beginning. I thought they were just saying they would just teach us that, okay, so here we got an LDL and it's evil and we need to lower it, period. But actually they try to explain a bit more on what happens to the LDL, how it gets oxidized and stuff like that. So it was not just LDL is evil and nothing more than that. But still, the whole model is based on the idea that somehow LDL gets into the wall. And so you say this is not possible.
Yeah, well, we know, the first thing is that we know, I mean, the discovery in 1984 by Goldstein and Brown of the LDL receptor.
Right.
In other words, LDL is floating in the bloodstream, and it has to, in order to get into a cell, that cell must possess an LDL receptor. Okay. And then the LDL links onto the LDL receptor and it's pulled into the cell.
Right.
There's no other way of getting LDL into the cell. That's it. So it doesn't actually matter what the concentration in the blood is. It doesn't matter at all. You still can't get it in unless the cell itself explodes and dies, in which case it no longer is a barrier to anything. So everybody knows, and we all know that this is the case, that you cannot get an LDL molecule into a cell unless the cell has a receptor. And yet, the hypothesis is if the concentration of LDL or oxidized LDL or whatever it is that you want to call it, gets higher, then more of it will be absorbed into the cell and then pass through the cell and into the artery wall behind. Well, we know that can't happen because we know that you require an LDL receptor. And in fact, if you look at homozygous familial hypercholesterolemia, which is obviously where the levels can be 20 times that normal, that if you get young people and replace their livers, if you do a liver transplant in young people with homozygous familial hypercholesterolemia, then their hypercholesterolemia or hyper-LDLemia disappears. So you can show by experimentally that the moment you put a new liver with that new LDL receptors in it into the body, the LDL just drops like a stone, which is proof that it can't get out of the bloodstream without there being LDL receptors available. In other words, there's no way to get it into any cell without an LDL receptor. So that's the first problem that you'd have to solve in saying, well, it doesn't matter whether it's oxidized or it's small and dense or it's large and fluffy or whatever terminology you want to use, you still can't get it into a cell without an LDL receptor. Ergo, or that means you cannot just say, well, because the concentration goes up, it must what? Get into a cell at one side, travel through the cell, which would be like you or I traveling half a mile.
Yeah.
And then you pop out the other side of the cell. What? With an inside-out LDL receptor that turns around and pushes it out of the other side.
Yeah, that would be exocytosis. And that all...
That would be, it would be exocytosis. Exocytosis can exist.
It can exist, but these would all be active transport processes, so which would require energy to take up more LDL than is actually required in the first place, then transported through the cell, that's transcytosis, and then actually throw it out the other side for some reason which is yet to be explained, because that would mean there is some active process going on of shoveling the LDL from the bloodstream through the endothelial layer out into the intimal layer in order for the LDL to accumulate in that layer and cause heart disease. So that would imply that this is an evolutionary designed process.
Exactly. And we can see that this doesn't happen because the brain has the blood-brain barrier, which basically means that the endothelial cells, even in the smallest blood vessels, are tightly joined together. There is no gap between them at all. That's what the blood-brain barrier is. And because of this, the brain has to synthesize its own cholesterol. And therefore, that's further proof that LDL can't get through endothelial cells that are not destroyed or obliterated in some way. And the other argument has been, and I've seen this argued by a number of people, that because you've got two endothelial cells and they sit together, and the LDL slips between them, and therefore this is the process. Well, again, this would be physiologically, this would be death.
Yeah.
We know that without the barrier to transport between cells, which there are, if you like, between the cells, there are proteins that link one cell to another, and they lock very, very tightly together. So
exactly.
It's not there is no gap, and it's been shown and proven that not even an ion can get between cells. This is a requirement for life that controls what they call the environment, the milieu. So you can't do it. I mean, yes, if the endothelial cells have been destroyed and have gone, well, that's a completely different argument. But according to what we know of human physiology, you can't get LDL through a cell. There's no reason to do it, and there's no mechanism to do it. And you can't get it to go between cells. There are several barriers to it to doing that. So therefore, if you're going to suggest the LDL hypothesis is correct, you've got to suggest that the human physiology does not exist. We would all be dead. We know that, because if you have an Ebola infection, the thing that Ebola does is it opens up the gaps between the bridges between cells, endothelial cells. Why, how it does it, I don't know. And because of that, stuff leaks out of the bloodstream, and that's why it's called hemorrhagic fever. So red blood cells escape, so you get bloodshot eyes, you start bleeding from your mouth. You basically bleed to death with Ebola. So we know that if you open up the gaps between endothelial cells, you die. And in fact, we know that having these tight barriers is a requirement for life of all multi-cell animals.
Otherwise, you will bleed to death.
Well, you're not just bleeding to death. The fluids will escape, and albumin will get everywhere.
Or fluids would escape. That would be bad enough, yeah.
I mean, we know ourselves that if fluids start escaping, if you have a low albumin level, and the osmotic pressure drives it from the stomach into the abdominal cavity, because there are in the gut wall, we have gaps between the endothelium. It has to be, otherwise we couldn't absorb any food. But once the protein level drops, it starts just leaking out, and then you get this enormous fat belly, which is what children in Africa have. Starving children have apparently big fat bellies. They're just full of fluid because of fluid leakage. So you can see fluid leakage is a desperately bad thing to happen, and our body does everything it possibly can to stop that happening. And yet we're told that LDL alone, of all the things in the bloodstream, of everything in the bloodstream, is the only one that cannot just somehow or other transport itself, effectively through. Then so could albumin, so could platelets, so could just about anything. And they don't. Why don't they? Because basic science. This is science 101, and yet we are
Right.
told not to believe in this because otherwise the LDL hypothesis is wrong, and we know it's right, so this must be wrong.
So that's
So
very
all the
interesting.
human physiology that we understand is wrong in order to make this
Yeah,
hypothesis work.
you've made that analogy, I think, either it was in the blog or in your recent book, which is called The Clot Thickens, by the way, and I really enjoyed reading it. It was a really nice one. And one analogy that you made, which I could resonate with exceptionally well, was the thing with the puzzles. So you explained it by, okay, we have that big picture and we start, we make a certain observation and we want to build a model which is capable of explaining this particular observation. And so we start, or back then they started by putting two puzzle pieces in the middle of the whole picture. And that was supposed to be the whole LDL cholesterol thingy. And then what they tried to do afterwards was to put and press and kind of, construct the rest of the entire puzzle around these two puzzle pieces, no matter if they actually fit or not.
Yeah.
And I actually love that analogy because it shows that it, for some reason, it doesn't seem to matter if things contradicted or didn't seem to match other observations, or if they were certain black swans that we just shoved them under the rug and didn't care about it at all. The most important thing was that these two central puzzle pieces remain.
Yeah. Well, it's a classic thing. I mean, it's the same as with the geocentric theory of the universe,
Right.
which was when the Earth is at the center and everything rotates around it. Well, you can make a model almost work. You can fit things around, and you can distort the entire observational world in order to make it work. But in the end, it's just wrong. And then when you get the pieces, you take these two pieces out, and you go, right, let's have another. When you do a jigsaw puzzle, you start with the pieces on the edge.
Exactly. Outside
and
in.
then you move to the middle. With this jigsaw puzzle, we got the two pieces in the middle and said, fit your jigsaw puzzle around that. And you can't.
Exactly, you just can't. And I think that's how true, genuine scientific process is supposed to work. That we come up with a model, say the geocentric model of the Earth, and it is actually able to explain certain phenomena and observations. Like, fair enough. But then, if we have more and more things which don't make sense and which are not, which we're not able to explain by this particular model, then we have several decisions to make. Either we modify the model, we change it, or we expand it, or if there's too many things which don't make sense at all, then we need to come up with a new model. I think that's how scientific process is supposed to work in the first place. And it's a shame to watch that this is not happening. And I think what's happening is actually a criterion for ideological thinking in general, that they take arguments even from the opposite side, which are supposed to disprove the hypothesis. And then what they do is take these arguments and turn them around so that they seem to support the hypothesis. It's such a fascinating thing, which ideologies are able to produce.
Yeah. No. Well, it is fascinating. I mean, it's something I'm most interested in is that, I mean, you find, I was looking at a study from the United States that they started to look at the LDL level of people who were admitted to hospital with heart attacks, myocardial infarction. That's about 250,000 people. And what they discovered was that the LDL level of those admitted, 76% of them had a lower than average LDL level.
Oh yeah.
And so instead of going, that sort of suggests we might be wrong.
Right.
They went, well, this just proves we need to get the LDL level
even lower. Right. This was so hilarious.
This is the exact opposite of logic. This is just nonsense. But it is.
That's a good example.
Another you may have heard of is Karl Popper. I think he was Austrian, not German. He was one of the Austrian sort of intellectuals. But he called it he was the man that created the idea of the black swan. But essentially he also was aware that if you find contradictory evidence, you can sort of ignore them if you create what they call an ad hoc hypothesis. So an example was the Newton's theory of gravity. was well, we know what it was, but essentially, when they looked at Mercury's orbit, they found that it was orbiting not according to Newtonian physics. It was going slower than it should do. It should have been going at that speed, and it was going at that speed. Well, not quite that difference. I mean, the difference was minute. However, so people said, oh, well, maybe Newton's ideas are wrong. And everyone said, well, Newton was correct, so he can't have been wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So they said, well, there must be another planet that we can't see that is interfering with the orbit of Mercury. And they called this planet Vulcan, which you maybe have heard of from Star Trek. Vulcan, that's where the name comes from. And people searched for Vulcan for decades. And people even claim to have seen it. Many people claim to have actually found it. And then, of course, they haven't. The reason why the orbit of Mercury didn't match Newtonian physics was because when you get closer to a high gravitational field, it slows time. And that agreed with Einsteinian physics, and that was where the special theory of relativity came from. So it's interesting, but that argument was used because people couldn't accept that Newton could be wrong. So they created a completely imaginary planet that didn't exist to explain it. And people were happy with that. They said, oh, that works. Another planet, we can explain it. So I mean, when people are capable of explaining the most ridiculous and obvious black swan. There are drugs called tresapibs, which you've never heard of. Well, maybe you have heard of them.
Well, I've heard of them, I guess.
And they were designed to raise HDL.
Oh yeah, exactly.
And then they lowered LDL by as much as statins. There was 4 of them, and torcetrapib, evacetrapib, something I can't remember. And that billions were spent on researching these medications, and they had no effect on cardiovascular disease, despite raising HDL, which is supposed to be good, and lowering LDL, which everyone says is good. No impact at all. And so instead of going, well, that looks like the end of the LDL hypothesis, they were just sort of ignored. And in fact, what they said was, well, they had other effects that increased the risk of cardiovascular disease, and this overrode the benefits that we would have seen.
So it still remains true. The hypothesis is still the correct one. It's just that we still didn't find the explanation that will be able to explain the observation using our model.
Exactly. I mean, so it's called ad hoc hypothesis, and as Popper said, you can actually create them endlessly. There is no end to them. You can go on and on. The reason for this is this. When women have higher LDL levels than men generally, and have significantly lower rates of cardiovascular disease, heart disease generally. So people said, oh, they're protected by their female sex hormones. There was no evidence for this, but they just said that it was a case because they couldn't think of any other reason. And then they did experiments, and in fact, women were advised to take hormone replacement therapy after the menopause. In order to protect against heart disease, because after the menopause, the rate of heart disease went up in women. Well, that rate of heart disease goes up as you get older, so it happens in men. It just happens a bit early. Anyway, so this was the explanation given was it's their sex hormones, and when women lose their sex hormones at the menopause, their protection against heart disease goes away. So women were actually advised to take HRT to protect against heart disease. Then they did some actual studies on HRT and found it increased the rate of heart disease, not hugely, but it actually did the exact opposite.
So if anything, it did the opposite.
If anything, it did the opposite. So you're going to say is, well, so what does protect women? No, they're not even bothering explaining this anymore. They've just given up on it. They've gone, well, they get the same amount of heart disease in the end. This is the counter argument is, well, if you look at a lifetime risk, women are just as likely to die from heart disease as men. But of course, once you reach the ages of 85, 90, and 95, people are dying of heart disease at this rate, and the women tend to catch up. But what we're talking about is preventing it when you're under 65. Under 65, in general, women have about a third or a quarter, maybe even less. In New Zealand, at one time when I looked at it, women had 18 times less cardiovascular disease death than men.
And so why do you think this is the case? Why do you think women are so much more apparently so much more protected against from heart disease compared to men?
This is a very complicated discussion. but it comes down to, in my opinion, and no one's ever really looked at this in any detail, but I've looked, one of my views when I started looking at heart disease was that stress, negative stress, which is actually strain, which is psychosocial stress, is a major cause of cardiovascular disease. And now I still believe that that's true. It's not the only cause. We're talking about many other causes. Now, it seems to be that women are much better at coping with negative, what we call psychosocial stress. They have friendships with other people that are stronger. They have stronger social bonds. In the UK, we have this idea of the man who goes and sits in a shed by himself, doesn't speak to anyone. I don't probably have the same in Germany. Whereas the women will tend to go out and have a chat and speak to their neighbours and have stronger social support and bonds. Now, if you look at some countries, there is no difference in cardiovascular between the death rates between men and women.
Interesting.
In fact, Black American women have at least as much, maybe slightly more, death from heart disease than Black American men, and their lifestyles are extremely different. And in fact, if you go to Israel, there's very little difference between men and women when it comes to cardiovascular disease. So it tends to be that the more sort of traditional societies, man out being a hunter-gatherer, a woman being at home and speaking to her friends and everything, there is a big difference in the way that they live their lives. Now, my strong belief is that this is where the difference lies. There's been very little effective study on this, but we can see, for example, if you look at immigrant populations, that immigrant populations that are dislocated from their background. So in the UK, a Muslim immigrant is I think at the moment it's 6 or 7 times more likely to die from heart disease than a Caucasian. All right. However, if you look at different populations, the immigrant Chinese population is less likely to suffer from cardiovascular disease. And if you I was looking at Sweden, where the immigrant Asian population have 5 to 6 times the rate of heart disease. It's about the same in the US. So there's an awful lot of psychosocial factors around which create stressors, and that then leads on to, if you like, cardiovascular disease. So I'm pretty certain, although I have no direct proof from anywhere, that women I can show you indirect proof that women are protected by the way that they deal with stressors, the more effective way that they create sort of relationships and family and support, whereas men tend to sit more isolated and tend to not deal with it so well. You can perhaps see this in Russia, and maybe not a good country to talk about at the moment, but in the Soviet Union, when the Soviet Union broke up, the rate of heart disease exploded.
Oh yeah.
But only in men, not in women.
Interesting.
And the life expectancy in Russia following the breakup of the Soviet Union went from 64 to 57, which is pretty small, isn't it? And that was 70% of that was cardiovascular disease.
Oh wow.
So men seem to be more affected by stress than women, and they do affect. You can see I can show you studies that men and women, if you stress them in different ways, have completely different responses. Different levels of cortisol, different levels of adrenaline are produced. They last different amounts of time. Blah blah blah. You can show that. You can show various steps on the path to why men and women are different, but no one's ever brought the thing into our.
So basically, you say we know that psychological strain or the reaction to a stressful situation or context reduces your risk of heart disease through various mechanisms that we might talk a bit more about too. But and then we know, or we imagine, I don't know if there is concrete evidence for that in the way women cope with these stressful situation is radically, or not radically, but in some sort different to the way men deal with these kind of situations.
Yeah, I think it's more a social relationship rather than a pure physiological relationship.
I see.
Which is why you can see such differences between countries.
Also, basically, the fact that women have better social relationships allows them to be better capable of dealing with stressful situations.
Yes. In most cultures. But when you get certain cultures, that's not the case. So when men and women are living lives that are much more similar, if you like, socially. The
Mm,
rates of heart disease become much more similar. So if you
I
have, say,
see.
in New Zealand, we had a very male society of men went out to work, men played rugby, men drank,
Right.
women didn't work, women sat at home. Same thing as you can see in South Africa.
Hmm.
When societies become so that men and women become more equal in their going out, earning, living, and all those other things, the differences begin to
The
diminish.
differences in
Quite
heart
quickly.
disease.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. That,
So you can,
and that and
as I
that
say,
yeah, that actually makes sense. Again, it's also a very controversial thing to say because apart from many controversial things that are currently going on, one of them is the constant push for equal, I don't know, outcomes in terms of jobs and what men and women do. But that's like one thing that's also uh, prevails through society over the past couple, I don't know, years or how long it's already been going on, and the whole feminist movement. And it has different pros and cons, obviously, but the point you're making is probably pretty interesting because the fact that it has probably most like always been the case over the course of the past, I don't know how many years, that men and women were living different lives in terms of the things they did and the different responsibilities they had. And so, if we now start to change this so quickly, then possibly you say that this might lead to women basically, you know, what's the word for that? But what I'm saying is to catch up, exactly, to catch up to the men when it
well,
comes to the heart disease risk.
don't twist yourself around in circles. I mean, I tend to make it very scientific. To say, women should be given every opportunity they want to do everything they want. But I
Sure.
believe that the social cis sort of structures that surrounded us for hundreds of years has, to a degree, not entirely protected women from the type of stressors that men have been dealing with for all
Mm-hmm.
this time. Now that they've got these stressors, you're at work and you've got a bullying boss,
Mm-hmm.
and you've got timelines that are very difficult to meet, and you've got two children nursery that you need to pick up, and all of these things are stressors that did not exist previously. I mean, of course, bringing up children is of course stressful, but it's in a different kind of way. So I think that if you look at, say, certain situations, Brazilian men and women have very similar rates of heart disease. Israeli women do, and in certain countries where the differences were huge, they've now narrowed down to a considerable margin. So you can't find anything in the standard risk factors for this. So I'm going to say, well, we know that psychosocial stress is an important driver of cardiovascular disease, and now that men and women are experiencing the same type and degree of psychosocial stress, the differences in heart disease rates are narrowing. Now, of course, other people say, well, it must be other reasons, but I don't think so. I think this is the reason. But I'm willing to have a debate.
Mm-hmm.
I can't think of any other reason to explain the difference. There's no physiological difference. The sex hormone
Is there
argument.
really is there really no evidence whatsoever for the hypothesis that sex hormones might be responsible at least partly for the difference in heart disease?
No,
Because
no, there was never.
that's the whole that's what's being taught in medical school. I mean, we had that recently, and I
You
didn't.
still get, you're still getting that one.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like
It's on,
that's the reason,
yeah,
and
well, yeah.
they think they explain us some mechanism, and I can't recall the exact mechanism, but they actually tell us how this works apparently, and we have these sex hormones and we have huge differences, and look how huge these differences are before menopause, and then suddenly something happens in menopause and the differences diminish so that the actual risk becomes equal between men and women.
Well, this is just utter nonsense, isn't it? That was disproved years and years and years ago. I was looking at studies before you were born, long before you were born.
Right.
And there was a woman, one of the first studies in like early 1960s, when they looked at women who'd had radical hysterectomies, with the removal of their ovaries, obviously.
Mm.
They had no sex hormones, and matched them with women who'd had hysterectomies without removal of the ovaries, and could find no difference whatsoever in the rates of heart disease.
Mm.
So this is going back 60 years.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of the acceleration of the rate of heart disease post-menopause was again, it was disproved. Well, it's a study from 1970 something. I remember
Mm-hmm.
looking at a very big study.
Also an old
I mean,
study.
the rate of heart disease kind of goes, whoop, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and the bit where it starts going whoop is about 55 or 60. So 95% of heart attacks happen after people are 60. So with women, what that happens, if you look at the graphs, men go whoop and women go whoop. Women do it about 10 years later on
Just
average.
later, okay.
And so, men are going whoop from the age of 50 and women are going whoop from the age of 60. So if you take a 50-year-old man and a 60-year-old woman and you look at their risk of dying of having a cardiovascular event, they're approximately the same, all other risk factors being the same.
Yeah,
And then they kind of parallel each other. So this has nothing to do with the menopause. This is just a shift of a curve to do
I
with age.
see. Okay,
You
that's
can't see
interesting.
any. If you actually draw the graph, which is what the study in 1970 did, was if you draw the graph, you can't see any acceleration beyond the acceleration you see with men. It's the same graph. It's the same curve. It's just shifted 10 years to the left or right, or whichever way you want to look at it.
Well, yeah. Mm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense.
And
And
then they did a study called HERS. Was it hormone replacement?
so an actual randomized trial where they gave
So the randomized
women.
trial was done using HRT in
Mm-hmm.
women to see if it would reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease,
Mm-hmm.
and it showed it slightly increased the risk of heart disease.
And that's supposed to be the gold standard, actually, that when we have the
Yeah, well, that's the
hypothesis,
gold
we,
standard. Yeah,
we test the hypothesis with a randomized controlled trial where
and it disproved it. Yeah.
and then we see if we can actually uh, prove in some sense actually provide evidence in favor of the hypothesis or provide evidence that would rather disprove the hypothesis
Oh
that we're
yeah.
making.
Well, of course, at the time, people then immediately said, "Oh, well, these are artificial female sex hormones,
Uh-huh.
and they're not the same as the normal sex hormones. Therefore, it's ad hoc hypothesis again. The reason why this trial was negative doesn't disprove the hypothesis. It just means we did it wrong. Well, do it again then. Well, they didn't do it again. I mean, the difference is very small. It doesn't really cause heart disease,
Right.
but it certainly does not protect you against heart disease. And in fact, they did a study on men who'd taken female sex hormones for prostate problems, and again found that actually with men, female sex hormones increased the risk of heart disease.
Mm.
So every time it's been looked at, it's been disproved, and
Interesting.
yet it still continues. It's like
Oh
this
man.
hypothesis is amazing. You can beat it with a large club until it's lying dead on the ground, and it just comes
Yeah.
back to life. And then it comes after you again because you dared to beat it with a large club. I mean, it is now. It would be funny if it wasn't so disastrous, And it gives you the idea, the power of an idea
Mm-hmm.
is just enormously powerful. I quote, you may have never seen the film Inception.
Oh yeah, I've
Uh,
seen that film, but actually it's an amazing one.
and what they say the start line is, what is the most
Mm-hmm.
resilient parasite? The most resilient parasite is an idea.
Is an idea exactly.
Trying to get rid of
Right.
an idea that people have got, and then they like it, they love it. It's simple and it explains and it's there and it's like I can see it, I can picture it, I
Right.
know it's right. And I sometimes say to
Yes.
people, that Isaac Newton was theoretically the greatest, most brilliant scientist perhaps of all time. Spent most of his life in alchemy trying to transmute lead into gold.
Mm-hmm.
That's what he was certain it could be done. And you
Mm.
say, yeah, we can almost see it. The lead is like a metal, and it's about the same density, and it has so many of the different characteristics of gold. It's got to be possible to turn this into that.
Because he had that
Well,
idea. He tried it
yeah,
over and over.
over and over. In fact, most of science started with alchemy. It was people trying to turn
Sure.
lead into gold, and then somebody going, "You do realize there's a different number of protons and neutrons, and actually, this is going to be tough."
Yeah.
Once people understood there was atoms that contained different protons and neutrons, alchemy was dead.
Mm.
And it's a bit like saying, well, if you understand that LDL can't get through the endothelium, then your hypothesis should be dead. But still, it
Yeah.
isn't. It hasn't been killed by it because people don't wish to see that the reality of science, the reality of basic science, tells us you're wrong. It must be wrong. All right. It's no
Why?
way
Yeah.
right.
Why do you think this is the case? If it's so crystal clear, and we will definitely talk a bit more about the actual things that are going on, etc., in terms of heart disease and atherosclerosis. And I'll definitely like to also ask you a bunch of devil's advocate questions, because I think that's also how science works, that we actually actively
Absolutely.
try
Yeah.
to disprove our own hypotheses. And but still, why do you think this is the case, that even though it seems to be so clear that LDL by itself is not the villain and maybe doesn't even have anything to do with the whole thing, why is it still that it's being taught in medical schools, and that the whole statin industry is based on that idea, and our entire dietary recommendations are based on that idea, which is another conversation in and of
Yeah.
itself. But why do you think that's the case?
Well, I think it's there's several reasons. One is it's a very simple idea,
Oh
um,
yeah.
and it's a story which people like can see it almost. You can visualize it. You know, you eat it because people have seen. Doesn't look like anything, and then you can see fatty stuff in your arteries. So you
Mm-hmm.
think so clearly it must go from there to there. That's how it happens. I mean, I saw an episode of Homer Simpson eating a burger, and in his stomach, the fatty little burgers came up and formed little barrier of burgers in his arteries. You know, it's like that's thinking. It's just like it is as ridiculous as that, but people do see it. People visualize a thing. They've got a story, and it's very very powerful.
Mm-hmm.
And, and and unless you understand, I mean, if you understand anything about how fat and cholesterol are dealt with by the human body and their metabolism and the liver and everything, the whole thing just becomes ridiculous from the start. You know, the original hypothesis
Right.
was that if you ate too much cholesterol,
Mm-hmm.
the level of cholesterol in your blood went up, and the cholesterol was then absorbed into your artery wall.
Right.
Ansel Keys promoted this initially. He then fed human volunteers lots of cholesterol, which basically eggs. The egg yolk, the
Mm.
yellow egg yolk has the highest level of cholesterol of any food stuff. I think probably true,
I
and
think so.
and it was giving people like 10 or 15 eggs to eat a day, and nothing happened to their cholesterol level. So he thought, okay, so that's not right. Yeah. Oh, well, I mean, of course it's not right, you idiot. Because our liver produces. If you ate about, I think you have to eat about, the average person would have to eat 20 eggs a day
Mm.
to get enough cholesterol from the eggs to match the body's daily requirement for cholesterol.
Yeah, it's a pretty ridiculous number, because our body
And,
produces so much of it.
we're just saying, well, why do you think our body's producing so much? Because it's really important for your health. Anyway,
Yeah, maybe that's a thing.
maybe that's the thing. And so he changed it. He said, oh, well, it's not cholesterol that does that. It's saturated fat that
Mm.
raises your cholesterol level. And he even came up with an equation. I can't remember the exact equation, but it was like blood cholesterol level is equal to saturated fat intake minus unsaturated fat intake divided by cholesterol intake over dy dx, whatever it was. It's some ridiculously accurate prediction, which was just, well, he already knew that cholesterol had no impact on your blood cholesterol level, and yet he came up with an equation that included cholesterol in it. You think, well, you already know that's wrong.
Right.
Anyway, so people believed this because, you know, and also at the time, in the late 40s, early 50s in the United States, there appeared to be an explosion in the rate of heart disease. Men were dying of heart disease at a high rate, and it apparently hadn't been happening before. Whether it had or not, I believe it had, but people had just not been paying attention to it
Mm.
because you'd had the Great Depression and you'd had
Mm-hmm.
the war, and then all sorts of things that kind of got in the way of people noticing it, and then suddenly, bang,
Mm.
hold on, there's lots of people dying of this. And then it started to happen
Mm-hmm.
around the world. And no one knew why. No one had any explanation for this. But this man, Ansel Keys, said, I know what's causing it.
Oh,
It's diet.
so quick solution, quick, easy solution.
And then after that, the American Heart Association became big proponents, and they started recommending super low fat diets, super low saturated fat diets. There was no evidence at the time that it did any good. There never has been any evidence. I mean, Ansel Keys in the 1960s set up a trial where he replaced saturated fat with polyunsaturated fats, a terribly healthy form of fat, called the Minnesota Coronary Experiment. It ran from 68 to 73, and it contained about 9,500 participants. And they found that the cholesterol level, I keep switching between LDL and cholesterol because the studies keep switching between LDL and cholesterol. So I'm stuck really. You can't talk about one thing. This is an ever moving target. But anyway,
Right.
the overall cholesterol level fell in these people, and which you would have thought was a great success. But unfortunately, the rate of cardiovascular disease went up considerably,
Mm-hmm.
and the rate of overall mortality for
Also.
every 1% fall in the cholesterol levels, a 2% increase in overall mortality.
And that's again
So
an actual gold
randomized
standard test of the hypothesis that we do a
Yeah.
randomized trial where we try to reduce people's cholesterol by dietary intervention. We see it works, and the opposite happens.
The opposite happened in Australia as well. There was a Sydney Heart study, which did pretty much the same thing. It was a smaller study, but the other interesting thing about that study is that the study was not actually ever published or released.
Right.
It was published and released in 2016.
Wow.
Because somebody finally discovered all the records in somebody's garage. One of the sons of one of the co-investigators happened to keep them all on magnetic tapes in a garage.
Wow.
And the investors came along and said, "Oh, I'd like to have a look at that." And they found that it completely and utterly destroyed the hypothesis. Right. And the Sydney Heart study, exactly the same. It was the same as a guy called Ramsden, an American researcher who decided to go and get all these data and put them together and found, you know what? Nothing has happened at all. But these studies, there was a study it recently run, actually done for the BBC by a doctor called Michael Mosley. It did get published in the BMJ, where they fed people a high saturated fat diet on top of their normal diet. So they were given, I think it was butter or olive oil, or I can't remember what the other form of saturated fat
Or maybe
was.
lard, some form of animal fat.
It was something. It had to be saturated because lard contains quite a lot of monoacidic.
Oh, okay. Coconut fat.
Might have been coconut because that's the highest saturated fat consumption you can get. Anyway, so they fed these people an extra 50 grams of saturated fat over about a month and measured their cholesterol and LDL levels. And what they found was it didn't make any difference at all. And this was actually the largest of the studies that had ever been done. Most of the studies that you read are done on 5 people or 2 people. They're really small.
Yes.
And they change other things in the diet simultaneously. So you don't really know what they did, But this was a study where you kept everything else the same and just added this.
Yeah.
And it made no difference whatsoever. So, I mean, all this, the dietary studies are absolutely the most useless, unscientific nonsense you'll ever see. I mean, people claim a thing called the Oslo Diet Heart Study, and it was done in prisons. And go look at the differences. It was like, just take that trial and throw it away. It was absolute rubbish, and yet people quote it. And in fact, the somebody I know well did a review of randomized control study data that was used when the dietary guidelines came in the late 70s in America and the rest of the world in about 1980 something, which is basically, if you want to prevent heart disease, reduce saturated fat intake, increase carbohydrate and polyunsaturated fats. Wonderful. Well, they looked at the data, the randomized control data that were available at that time, and the analysis proved that there was none. There was no data at all to support the recommendations. And since then, there is no more data available.
Right, and there's been actually quite a few meta-analyses that show that exactly that thing, that saturated fat intake does not correlate whatsoever, even like neither in randomized control trials nor in epidemiological studies. There is no clear correlation between saturated fat intake and the incidence of cardiovascular disease or mortality.
No, none. I mean, and the data, the pile of data is building higher and higher and higher, and yet we still have exactly the same unchanged recommendations.
Yes.
I mean, the American Cardiovascular Society, ACC, about 6 years ago, I think, wrote a review, and they said, well, they didn't want to talk about saturated fat. They said dietary cholesterol is no longer.
Oh yes. A nutrient of concern.
An ingredient of concern. In other words, it doesn't cause anything at all. And yet we still have low cholesterol diets promoted. And in fact, they kind of kept very quiet about that. But that was their recommendation based on the evidence. So, I mean,
Yes.
the evidence to support the diet heart hypothesis
Hmm.
is non-existent. I
Yeah,
can say that. It is non-existent.
exactly. So there
Some
is,
observational studies, different things have been done, but it's essentially non-existent. And perhaps I believe, if you look at it properly, I mean, as I use, people would say, well, we have had enormous dietary studies going on for hundreds of years, and one of them happened in France, and they have the highest saturated fat consumption
oh,
in
for
Europe,
instance, yes, that's
and
one
they have the
example.
lowest rate of cardiovascular disease in
Or
Europe.
take Hong Kong, for example, with one of the highest meat consumptions and one of the longest life
Yes, I
expectancies.
mean, it,
These are black
I will say,
swans.
I mean, I do find myself thinking we like to believe we're scientific, but when we've got the hypothesis, the LDL cholesterol hypothesis, the diet heart hypothesis, it changes its name and its structure in front of your very eyes all the time. But whatever it is, we know most people would say, oh, it's fat in the diet, raises your cholesterol, and that causes you to get heart
Right.
disease. No part of that hypothesis is true. The
Hmm.
most ridiculous part, for which there is absolutely no underpinning, is the dietary part. It
Okay.
just does not exist.
So
And in
let's
fact,
let's 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 take it apart. The hypothesis. We say saturated fat. The hypothesis: saturated fat raises LDL cholesterol,
yeah,
and that by itself is already not correct. You say.
well, it's not correct. No.
Well. Okay.
Well, I mean, if you look at it from a physiological basis
Mm-hmm.
as well, and which is where I like to go to, is say, can you show me a mechanism?
Exactly. Show me a mechanism. Show me how it
Show me a
works.
mechanism. I mean, we know that fat, if we eat fat, it actually links to cholesterol in your bowel. That's
Mm-hmm.
what bile salts are. They come from your gallbladder. Otherwise, we can't absorb them. They just travel straight through, which is why if your gallbladder is playing up, then you get what they call steatorrhea, pale, bulky, offensive, full of fat stools. So you need it to link to cholesterol. It forms then a cholesterol ester,
Mm-hmm.
fat plus alcohol equals ester. And then it's absorbed into your bowel. Your bowel creates a thing called a chylomicron, which is a really big lipoprotein, fills it up with fats and fatty acids and esters and whatever, and then shoves it straight into your bloodstream through a thing called the thoracic duct. So
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't go to your liver, it goes straight into your bloodstream. And when it then travels around your body, losing fats mainly and some of the cholesterol, and it shrinks down and down and down and down. So it starts at this size, ends up this size, and then your liver absorbs it using a thing which is actually a slightly altered LDL receptor, and then it's what's left of it ends up in your liver. So 98% of the fat that you eat does not go to your liver and has no connection with anything to
Yeah, it
do with
gets
it.
used by the heart muscles or by the or gets absorbed in the adipocytes,
Yeah,
and then we end up with these VLDL molecules that are being absorbed by the
yeah,
liver.
yeah. Well, they know that LDL small. They're called chylomicron remnants. They just happen to be about the
Oh,
same
okay.
size as an LDL. And then they're broken down, and the various parts of them are reused.
Mm-hmm.
What the liver does is, if you eat carbohydrates,
Mm.
right, basically sugars, so rice, bread, potatoes, everything that's not meat or fat or whatever, it goes to your liver as glucose or fructose.
Mm.
Right? That's it. There's one or two other sugars, but we'll forget that then. And if you eat too many of them, they go into your liver, and your liver says, right, what do I do? What do I do with these things? If you have low stores of glucose, it will replenish this glucose stores in your
Mm.
liver, in your muscles, etc., etc. Past that point, it won't release them. So, and it can't release them because otherwise, all that would happen is your blood sugar level would go through the roof.
Mm-hmm.
So it stores them, traps them, and turns them into fats. The
Mm.
liver turns glucose into fatty acid. It turns fructose into glucose and glucose into fatty acids. The fatty acids are then linked together in various
Mm-hmm.
forms, put into a VLDL molecule, which is triglyceride, and then sent out into your bloodstream. And when they're sent out into your bloodstream, they're stripped of the fats and they shrink down until they become an LDL molecule. They pass to be an intermediate density to a low density lipoprotein, and then they are reabsorbed back into the liver. That's what happens to the vast majority of them. So as you can see, the only linkage between dietary intake and LDL is via carbohydrates. There is
Oh,
no
yeah.
linkage between fat consumption and VLDL or LDL.
Mm.
They are two completely different systems. And yet we're supposed to believe that if we eat saturated fat, which raises chylomicrons, it doesn't go through your liver. It
Are you
raises,
familiar? Are you familiar with Dave Feldman and his works?
I know I've met Dave Filman, yeah. I think
So
he's
yeah, so
right about the fact that
mhm,
we look at lipoproteins in the wrong way, and they're mainly energy transportation devices.
mhm.
I'm not quite so sure. He claims you can raise your LDL and lower it by vast amounts by doing various things. Well,
Well, what the observation he made basically was that people transitioning from a standard American diet to a ketogenic diet, some of them experienced a ridiculous spike in their LDL cholesterol, which
yeah,
partly, it went from physiological levels, you could argue about what is physiological and what's not, but from normal levels, let's say, to FH levels sometimes even. So
yeah,
people that had prior to the ketogenic diet, they had an LDL of say 100, 120, whatever, and then it went up to 600, 500. So a
yeah,
ridiculously high number. And it's understandable that some of them are very concerned about it because we are led to believe that this is extremely dangerous. And he came up basically with an explanation with his lipid energy model that tried to explain that if your body is working primarily on fats, then this might be an explanation for why you end up with higher LDL in your body, because you have
yeah.
more VLDL trafficking, and then it gets so the VLDL essentially ends up as an LDL in the final equation, and that's why you some of the people they end up with the way higher LDL.
Well, I'd say it's very few people because the work of David Unwin in using high fat, low carbohydrate diet, he never saw that happen to anybody.
Right.
That was over 200 people. So this is not a common thing.
So why do you think that's happening then?
I think it primarily happens because the body the liver reabsorbs LDL in order to create more VLDLs because it uses the proteins, the apolipoproteins, which are complex and difficult proteins to create, which are then recognized by the various receptors. Right now, if the body is getting all the fat it needs in the diet and just sending it out as chylomicrons, and the cells are using this, and you're now, if you like, using the fats rather than the glucose for energy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then you don't have any extra energy stored in your liver. So the liver has very little need to produce VLDLs. What's it going to do with it, And so it doesn't bother absorbing the LDL. It just says, I don't need this any longer. So the LDL just sits around in the bloodstream, not being required by the liver, which then doesn't pick it up, which says, well, I don't need it. Because there's feedback mechanisms going on in the body all the time. The feedback mechanism here is, I've got all the apolipoproteins I need. I don't need the LDL, the ones from the LDL, so it can just stay out in the bloodstream as long as it likes. So it's just showing you like a physiological response in some people. I think you have to get quite extreme for that to happen. You have to be like, I'm not going to eat another carbohydrate in my life sort of person, which most people don't actually achieve.
And another observation that he made in conjunction with the people that were going onto a ketogenic diet is that those who are who experienced this jump in LDL were exceptionally, or seem to be exceptionally, athletic and lean. So do you think this is plausible?
Well, I think that is plausible because these people are probably they may well be physiologically different from other people.
Okay.
And the way that they shuttle and require VLDL. So if you're very, very lean, you're not going to need the VLDLs. If you don't need the VLDLs, the liver has no need to absorb LDLs. So it just sits in the bloodstream, and which would explain also another explanation is so why it just shows the body doesn't really care what the LDL level is. It doesn't mind if it goes high. It doesn't mind if it's low. It's just a thing that sits around. All right, we think it's terrible. It must bring it down. But, you can see with the same argument with homozygous familial hypercholesterolemia. The liver can't absorb it, so the level goes shooting through the roof.
Right. So let's maybe now that's a good place to get back to the LDL, to LDL and how it translates into an increased risk or not. So you just touched on familial hypercholesterolemia, and that's a condition where people are born essentially with a way higher total cholesterol levels and LDL cholesterol levels than the normal population. And so what's the thing with FH? Because I think this is also one of the pillars that people like to use, or scientists or doctors like to use in favor of the LDL cholesterol lipid hypothesis, that they basically say, okay, so we have that condition where people have nothing else other than an increased LDL cholesterol, and it's through the roof, and they have very rapid atherosclerosis. So clearly there has to be a causal relationship between these two. And it's, by the way, it's pretty difficult to argue against that, because it seems crystal clear.
It's actually not difficult to argue against that.
Well, at first glance, if you don't know anything else about it, if you just see, okay, they have very high LDL and they die pretty quickly from heart disease. So, wow, that seems to be pretty obvious at first glance.
Yes. Well, that's an argument that's very commonly used.
Right.
Don't worry, I've come across it many, many times. If you're talking about homozygous, where the levels are 30 times as high, you have a completely different situation here. And there's no point in even discussing that, because all sorts of different things are going on with having the hugely high levels of lipoproteins sitting around in your bloodstream. You can see them being absorbed into tissues around. They can become, the LDL can leak out, if you like, and it forms a kind of storage. We're looking at storage disease with homozygous, but when we're looking at other forms of hypercholesterolemia, as an example, the 72-year-old gentleman from the States wrote to me saying that his LDL was 18, and
is it millimole? Is it millimole per liter?
Millimole per liter.
Okay.
18 millimoles per liter, which is about 6 times normal. He knew this, and he'd been investigated for years. He tried statins, he tried this, he couldn't take statins. And he's been investigated for years and years and years, and no one had found a single trace of atherosclerosis in his body, ever. He won't be the only one. He just had to be the most extreme. And the reason that when he first wrote to me, I said, well, that's lovely, but I don't know who you are, and I don't know if your story is true. It would be nice to believe it was true. And then he sent me an article that he was then used as a case history. He'd been written up, and I think it was the Journal of, I can't remember which journal it was. Anyway, he then appeared. This is true. All right.
Right.
People say that's just an exception. Anyway, but the reality is that, yes, if you get familial hypercholesterolemia, which is high LDL emia, actually, it's nothing.
Yes.
Cholesterol. It should be called hyper LDL emia. That a small subsection die at a young age. Now, if you look at the actual figures, and then they say, oh, there's a 500% increase in the rate of heart disease in under 40s or whatever. The figures are, for the UK, if you look at the Simon Broome Registry, which has been looking at this for years, we're talking at about, I think, 12 people rather than 3 people. I think the entire statistic is based on 8 or 9 people dying before the age of 40. The actual number is giant.
Oh, I see. It's again absolute risk reduction versus relative risk reduction.
The absolute increase in risk is minute.
Yes.
The relative risk is 400, 500%.
Because already people that younger than 40 years of age already die from a very low rate of heart disease.
Yeah, they've got a very low rate. So
very low rate. And if you now
1 in 100,000.
Exactly, and if you now have an increase of 5x, this is like 3 more people.
Yeah, or 4 in 100,000 rather than 1 in 100,000.
Right.
We're talking about this sort of level. It's not like half of them die before the age of whatever. And in fact, even I presented a paper in 1966. They looked at patients with familial hypercholesterolemia who lived exactly the same length of time as everybody else, on average.
So average life expectancy doesn't change.
Doesn't change. There was another study done in the Netherlands where they looked at people. They looked at people who they knew, people who had familial hypercholesterolemia, and then went back and looked at the death certificate records, knowing that it's genetic. They could then trace it down and say. So they did a study from like 1850, even though obviously these people were all dead. They could tell you how long did they live, and these are the ones with familial hypercholesterolemia, because we know that it passed this way. And what they found was that people with familial hypercholesterolemia in the 19th century lived longer than everybody else.
Oh, wow.
There was a period from about 1910 to 1950, something like that, where their life expectancy was reduced, and since 1950 it's been the same.
Why do you think that's the case?
Well, I think that there's a strong argument. This is not my argument. That if you have LDL is also an anti-infective agent.
Oh yeah.
It binds to infectious agents. In fact, if you get mice, they've shown experiments, and I think it's mice. It might have been rats, and they had higher LDL levels, and then they deliberately infected them to give them a septicemia. The ones with the highest LDL were, I think, 9 or 10 times less likely to die from the infection.
Yeah, there's been actually
Maybe-
quite some evidence. There's this study, then there's the study that shows that ApoB interferes with bacterial quorum sensing and
Oh,
is
yeah,
able
yeah.
to bind up endotoxins from, I think it
Yes.
was Staphylococcus aureus, something like that. So
Yeah.
there is evidence that
Yeah.
ApoB containing lipoproteins participate in combat and in host defense in combating
Yeah.
infections.
Well, I think the fact is that everything in the blood probably has some role in host defenses.
Sure.
They've all been designed that way. I mean, the immune system and the coagulation system are historically come from the same place.
Oh wow,
And
yeah, right.
so I mean, people go, oh, how could LDL have any effect on infection? Well, because it's in the blood, isn't it? And
Yeah.
everything that the human body creates in the blood has got all sorts of different things and functions, and
Probably it does.
everything does.
Right, right.
So you look at if you look at LDL and VLDL is actually pro-coagulant. It increases blood flow.
Is it VLDL?
VLDL
VLDL is
the most
procoagulant.
pro-coagulant, and HDL is actually anticoagulant. And
Mm-hmm.
why would this be the case? Well, because it just is. All right, these are just facts. Was it designed that way, or was it some historical thing that happened 40, 50 million years ago, and we still have it? No, but the fact is that LDL binds to toxins and it binds to bacteria, and it helps to protect you against infection. So during the 19th century, the commonest reason why people died was infectious diseases, TB, and syphilis, and you get a cut and you die. So if you had something that stopped you dying when you got an infection, then that was probably a protective mechanism. That may be why people have got FH.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting.
This century was less infection, there was better water supply, blah blah blah. And once antibiotics came along, then it was less of an advantage to have a high LDL level because we had other ways of.
Well, now the question becomes: is there a disadvantage of having high
Well,
LDL?
is there now a disadvantage? Well, the disadvantage, if it exists, is small, if it exists at all. But then you say, well, obviously there are other things as well going on. I mean, once you look at human physiology, you find that everything is kind of connected to everything else, all right? Because there is another. In fact, I've written papers on this. We're putting another one together at the moment, which is that a number of people who have familial hypercholesterolemia, who have that encoded LDL receptor genes gone slightly wrong. This is very, very close to the gene for a number of blood clotting factors, including factor 8.
Oh, so the gene that that codes for the LDL receptor, which is oftentimes or the one thing that is not functioning properly in FH state.
There's different forms of dysfunction, deficiency, and some people have less LDL receptors.
Right, exactly. And so the gene
different shaped receptors and blah blah blah. So there's all sorts of different
exactly all kinds of different manifestations. But so the gene that codes for the LDL receptor is located just it's on a chromosome. It's located very closely in close proximity to receptors that code for clotting factors.
Yes, and also the LDL receptor itself removes clotting factors from the blood. That's one of its functions. So if you have less LDL receptors, you will have more clotting factors.
We never learned that in medical school, by the way.
No, you wouldn't have learned this in medical school.
We will never.
So what you can find is that if you find they tried to do I'll try and get this right. They had brothers with the gene, the mother had FH or the father had FH or whatever, and one of them had FH, one of them doesn't have FH, one of them doesn't have the cholesterol increase, but the rate of heart disease in both of them is identical because they actually carry the other gene, which is the clotting factor gene. So we've looked at it and said it must be the LDL, but actually we can remove the LDL as a possibility and say it's not the LDL, it's the clotting factor abnormality that is associated with, I don't know if it's right next to it as a gene or the two of them were quite often found together. I have no idea the geographical location on the DNA. But essentially, yes, you can see that there is genomic correlation between siblings. All right.
So we don't know if they're located close to each other, but there seems to be a correlation between.
Yeah, well, if you have one, you like to have the other. I don't know if they are physically next to each other.
Right. Right.
But if you've got one, you're quite likely to have the other.
If you have a mutation in the ApoB gene, Oh, in the LDL receptor gene in FH, then you're very likely to also have a mutation in this gene that codes for this particular clotting factor.
I mean, there are other ones, but I'm just using factor 8 as the most.
Factor 8, okay.
No, because the factor 8 is obviously the blood factor, clotting factor that's missing and most commonly in haemophilia, which means you bleed more regularly. Now, people with haemophilia, prior to the development of factor 8, synthetic factor 8, they had a tendency to bleed to death, right?
Right.
However, the rate of cardiovascular disease was 1/5 of that of the surrounding population.
Interesting.
So, and in fact, when you look at it, having a more or less coagulable, less blood that's less likely to clot, and there's millions of reasons. There's things like von Willebrand disease, there's factor 8 deficiency, blah blah blah. There's a million of them, and these people are much less likely to die from cardiovascular disease. Because von Willebrand factor is interesting because you can have a lack of von Willebrand factor, which means you're more likely to bleed.
And that would be, by the way, probably a disadvantage back then when we were actually more likely to bleed.
Bleeding to death is not a good thing if there's saber-toothed tigers around.
Exactly.
So, however, not bleeding to death is good if you don't want. So, bleeding to death is a good characteristic if you don't want to get cardiovascular. So, with von Willebrand factor, you can have with factor 8, you either seem to have not enough or the right amount. But with von Willebrand, you can have too little or too much. Right? There are people who have too much. And if you have too little von Willebrand factor, you're about 50% less likely to die of cardiovascular disease or have a cardiovascular event. Too much von Willebrand factor, you're about 3 or 4 times more likely to die of a cardiovascular event. So the actual difference is about 7-fold across the spectrum of von Willebrand factor. And of course, we have a thing called Hughes syndrome, called Antiphospholipid Syndrome, which triggers blood clotting. Most doctors have never heard of. It's quite a number of people and can cause death from. And if you looked at a real disease that caused people to die of heart disease when they were younger than 40, Antiphospholipid Syndrome, Hughes syndrome, that's the one. They make up. I think it was, although they make up something like 1% of the population, they make up. I may be getting this figure wrong, but I think it's 50% of the number of ischemic strokes before the age of 50.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
It's huge.
It's a pretty big number. And pretty big contributor, yeah.
And heart attacks and strokes and whatever. So they've got a clotting factor abnormality. So when you look at FH and you say, oh, it's all due to the LDL, you say, well, actually, there is a subsection of FH where the clotting factor is a significant issue. And it's this subsection that leads to this small subsection of premature death from FH. Whereas the majority of people, once you're past the age of 60 with FH, you are less likely to die of heart disease than the surrounding population. So the argument for this would be, well, if you smoke cigarettes up till 60, you're more likely to get lung cancer. But if you smoke cigarettes after the age of 60, you're less likely to die of lung cancer.
Yeah, that would imply that your physiology changes in some radical way after you pass 60.
Yeah. It's just nonsense.
Right. Yeah.
It is an argument of nonsense. But yeah, everyone holds this up as this amazing fact. Well, it's a fact that, but you know, like a lot of things, you have to say, well, let's look at it a little more closely. And you find it disintegrates in front of your very eyes. But weirdly, the person who did the study on genetic FH and life expectancy, a guy called Silbrands from the Netherlands, is the most fanatic. I've communicated with him a few times. He's just mad.
That's
well,
quite ridiculous.
How can you do this study and then say that? You know?
Oh man, that's cognitive dissonance at its best.
Well, it is worst.
Yeah, at its worst. Right. So before maybe go more into the things, the processes, the physiological things that you describe in your book, I first would like to completely take apart piece by piece the current LDL hypothesis as it stands, and we already covered or partly covered. I have one more question for you in terms of how LDL might get into the artery wall. And have you heard of that guy, Dr. Vladimir Subotin?
Yes.
So his hypothesis is basically is the exact opposite of the inside-out hypothesis. Maybe you've probably talked with Ivor Cummins about it, or
Oh, I've talked about his hypothesis many times.
right, exactly. And I find it pretty. At least I still find it pretty interesting, pretty compelling.
No, I think it's a very interesting hypothesis.
And so for people who are not aware what the hypothesis states, it's basically that LDL enters the artery wall, the intima, from the outside. So not from the bloodstream, from the lumen, but from the outside through neovascularization, through these vasa vasorum, the blood vessels of the blood vessels. Because still the starting point is still, as he states, the damage to the artery wall, and that leads to hyperplasia of the intimal layer. That results in hypoxia, so oxygen deficiency in the deep layers of the intima, and that's why we have neovascularization. And through these blood vessels, LDL kind of leaks into the intima, and it accumulates there because you have certain proteoglycans in the deep layers of the intima, which have a very high affinity to ApoB. And so I know the argument you make against vasa vasorum is that veins have more vasa vasorum than arteries, and that's why that this is a stupid explanation. But what he says is basically that the intima is not vascularized in the first place. In the physiological state, you have no vascularization in the intima. So the process of lipid accumulation in the intima doesn't happen in a normal human being unless you have damage, and then vasa vasorum get into the intima, and you can get lipid accumulation there. What's the problem with that hypothesis? Or is there a problem with that hypothesis?
Well, it's quite a good hypothesis, I would say. But it's kind of reverse engineering, if you like, in my opinion.
Right.
Because the first thing that you want to look at and say is you can get atherosclerosis in vessels that have no vasa vasorum. And in fact, the vasa vasorum appears after the damage. So it's kind of back to front, this idea, if you like.
Mm-hmm.
The question in my mind is, if you if you do coronary artery bypass grafts, where you take a vein and stick it in, pretend to be an artery, the more vasa vasorum that you maintain, the less likely you are to get cardiovascular disease. And the more that you damage the vasa vasorum during the transplantation, the more likely you are to get heart disease. So the idea that vasa vasorum are the transporters of LDL into the artery wall doesn't work from that perspective. Also, I mean, if you read the book, you'll understand that I looked at young children who had, and this is going back to the 1950s, because you can't do these studies now because it's impossible, who had heart defects which were not treatable, because you couldn't treat heart defects in the 1950s because there was no heart lung transplant machines. So if you opened up the heart, then everybody died. So you couldn't do that. So they were firing blood clots out of the heart in various different ways, which are then ending up in the lungs. And then they could see. So these are 5-6-year-old young children, right? And they were developing atherosclerotic plaques in their lungs. Now you don't have.
I recall.
And so the damage, the first point of damage was you obviously just damaging the lining of the artery, and you were covering it in a blood clot, or filling it up, or even completely jamming the artery completely solid with a blood clot. All right. So the first thing that happened was the blood clotting and the damage to the lining of the artery. Well, there's nothing happening in the adventitia. It couldn't have been the case. It's impossible. That's not where the blood clot started. And these children were so young that there was no possibility that they could have been because of long-term whatever
exposure,
alive long-term, right? These were children who were dead, right? And they died young of other things due to their heart problems.
Right.
So, but we could see also transformation of some of these blood clots into things that looked exactly like an atherosclerotic plaque. But also the other interesting thing was at that point, you could see the increased number of vasa vasorum appearing. There was what they call neovascularization around these points. So the process was clearly that, first of all, you damage the artery itself, then the neovascularization occurs, which in my opinion is a repair mechanism.
So not the cause of the whole issue, but it happens afterwards, you say?
What you're seeing is, because normally the oxygenation and the nutrients can get into the endothelial cells as such, they need them, and probably the intimal layer, which is why the vasa vasorum don't reach that point. They're not needed at that point.
Yeah, exactly. They are not even they don't even vascularize the intima. Like intima,
No.
it's by itself is an avascular compartment.
Yeah. Well, it is, if you like, it's a vascular component.
Yeah.
The cell in that area doesn't need to be given nutrients from behind,
Right?
Which in the medial layer of the thicker arteries and stuff, because they can't get it from the lumen, because it can't reach at that point.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not required, all right? So what you're seeing is in the process is you get a blood clot, blocks a blood vessel, it's gradually, whatever happens to it, that area becomes vascularized because the oxygenation to this area has become very poor all of a sudden. You know, it's got a blood clot sticking in the way. So in order to get enough nutrient to supply, you get angiogenesis and the creation of new vasa vasorum at this point to feed much further down into the intimal layer, which is now no longer, right?
Okay, so you're saying when we are going to discuss the process, the pathophysiological process of blood clotting and how that leads to atherosclerosis, then this gets incorporated, as we will later discuss, into the artery wall, and then the whole neovascularization thing happens.
Yes, it's damage in the first, neovascularization second. That's the process. You can see that happening in cerebral arteries which don't have vasa vasorum. You can see that the first thing that happens is the damage, and then after that the neovascularization occurs.
Mm-hmm.
So in my opinion, the hypothesis explains better what we're seeing, but it does not explain why we're seeing it.
Right.
And you know, they found with animals, you can get, they did it with animals. They got their veins, and then they fed blood clots into their veins, right? Then went through their heart and into their lungs, and they caused the development of atherosclerosis in the lungs of these animals just by feeding in small blood clots through the main circulation. All right, so that was seen as a process,
right?
You can explain why that happens in a temporal. You can see if you're not bothered about the timing of it, the Sabatini hypothesis works in that he explains what you're seeing. But the timing thing, he's suggesting, in my opinion, that the time goes into reverse, or thing A happens before thing B, when the reality is thing B is actually happening before A, as it must do. So you're seeing an impact of the damage that's suggesting that the impact is the thing that causes the damage. In my opinion, it's a bit like seeing someone who has a swollen ankle when they twist their ankle, and then going, "Oh look, you know, it must have been the swelling that causes the twist." No, it's a twist. You know, and I have used that example of, you know, a broken ankle, you know, causes swelling and inflammation. It's the same argument with inflammation. Everyone goes, "Oh, it's inflammation nowadays." People say it's inflammation. I go, yeah, but inflammation has to be caused by something.
Exactly.
You know, inflammation doesn't suddenly happen and for no reason suddenly get worse and worse and worse until your ankle breaks, you know?
The whole thing with inflammation is also a very peculiar one, because that's another thing what people constantly keep saying, that it's an inflammatory process, and that exacerbates atherosclerosis. And also in our lectures, it's always been described as an inflammatory process, and sure, it is in some sense an inflammatory process, but it's being portrayed as if the inflammation itself is what causes damage. And it's so funny, because if I actually listen closely to these lectures, then they actually it's so funny, because at one point it stops making sense, because first they say we have damage and something leads to inflammation, and then at a later point they kind of try to make the argument that the inflammation caused the damage. I mean, like, but you actually just stated the opposite, that you had damage and the damage caused the inflammatory response.
Well, if you're going to put your puzzle the wrong way around, if you're going to say that the Earth is at the center of the universe, then you have to explain why planets go in loops
Right.
around the Earth, and then it all starts to fall apart. But if you don't concentrate too hard on that, you just go, yeah, well, damage, inflammation, damage, LDL, blah, blah, blah. We all know what the answer is, but we're just trying to tell you that these are the processes which don't make any sense.
Right.
The Sabatini, I mean, it's actually Ufi Ravneskov, who I know, also believes that what happens is you get infectious agents that enter the vasa vasorum. They block the vasa vasorum, they cause the inflammation and the damage, and that's the underlying mechanism behind plaque formation. So everything is infectious.
Is that reasonable? Or can that be a contributor?
Well,
can that be a reason, a cause?
Well, infectious diseases increase the risk of cardiovascular disease. There's no doubt about that. But they don't do it, in my opinion, anyway, they don't do it through that process. Again, what he's done is he's seen a thing which is, well, you can find remnants of infectious agents in plaques, and therefore the infectious agents must be causing the plaques. I say, the reason that the plaques form around the infectious agent as part of the thrombotic, the blood clotting process. You're going to get that trap version. We can see this. We see this with SARS-CoV-2, which increases the risk of blood clotting and heart attacks and strokes and whatever. And you say, well, yeah, but that's the case. Is the infectious agent is around, it triggers processes that then cause the blood clotting. We know that's the case, but actually, there's also so many other causes of this happening. You can't say it is. What I say is you can't say it's the cause. You can say it's a cause.
Okay. So infectious agents can be a cause.
A cause of cardiovascular disease. We know that periodontal disease increases the risk of cardiovascular disease. That's a fact, all right? We know that various infections can increase the risk of blood clotting and strokes and heart attacks. We know these things. We know Kawasaki's disease, which is caused by an unknown infectious agent, can cause young children to have heart attacks at the age of 5. We know these things are true, but it's a cause. It's not the cause. And this is a problem a lot of people have had, is they focus in on one thing and they go, that's the thing. And you go,
right.
That's one of many things.
And that's why it's way smarter to look at the actual process. What is happening that eventually results in this plaque formation and in heart disease, rather than saying, okay, we need to find one single thing, one common determinator of all these causes that we can all boil down to one thing which is common among these things, which is pretty hard to do in this situation.
Well, of course it is, because it's complicated. There's a lot of noise, and trying to discern the signal amongst that noise is difficult. When you've got 500 different things that all appear to cause heart disease, some of which maybe do and some of which maybe don't, trying to say, well, okay, so we've got, for instance, systemic lupus erythematosus, and we've got an infectious disease, and we've got Hughes disease, we've got lead poisoning, we've got smoking,
diabetes,
diabetes,
stress, all these things that we talked about in the beginning, stress,
so
psychological.
It looks like the biggest puzzle that ever existed in the whole world. Got a million pieces.
And by the way, I want to comment real quick on exactly that point, because that's one of the many reasons which has fostered my skepticism of the mainstream LDL cholesterol hypothesis. Because let's take smoking as an example. There we have smoking in relation to lung cancer, because there we have an example of something which is directly causal and where we have crazy hazard ratios of like 30x or 20x, where we know if this is the cause, this single cause, or one of the single causes, then the hazard ratios ought to be extremely huge, because this is the one thing that causes lung cancer. And so if everyone says that LDL is the cause, is the determining factor, the most important player in this whole game of heart disease formation and plaque formation, then how do all the other thousands of different risk factors play into that? How are they connected to LDL? If LDL is the central piece, what has depression to do with LDL? What has type 2 diabetes to do with LDL? What has high blood pressure to do with LDL all in it all itself. It doesn't make any sense, you know?
No. Well, it doesn't make any sense because you can't create it together. So it's yeah. I mean, and of course, and you've discovered that a lot younger than I ever did. You think, well, it doesn't fit. How does smoking cause the same disease as diabetes?
Right.
Whereas
Peculiar.
how?
Yeah, it's weird.
And yet it obviously does. So there must be some way that it does.
Right.
It has to be a mechanism of some sort.
Yeah, and we'll go into that mechanism. We'll go into that mechanism.
Well, what I'm going to say to you now is, we can reconvene. I just have an appointment in 15 minutes, and I've got to go and go to.
Right.
I didn't realize it was going to go quite this long, but it's a very interesting discussion. So
Sure.
what I'd like to do is split it, and if you let me know another day in the nearest future, we can continue.
Okay.
But for right now,
100%. 100%, because we didn't even start talking about the actual mechanism. So
no.
Okay, so let's leave the discussion.
I'll let you edit it as you wish.
Well, I don't know if I'll edit it at all, but the thing is, we'll probably leave the whole discussion around the actual pathophysiological mechanism of blood clotting and what you describe in your book for another day. And I think this will take at least just as long, because I really want to take it apart and get to the very core of the whole thing, which is also the reason why I've been engaging in this deep dive of heart disease and atherosclerosis, because things just have to make sense until I let them go.
Well, yeah. Then, you're a bit like me.
Right.
My thing.
I felt that enthusiasm reading your blog and reading your book. I was like, that's exactly that.
Well, I hope to, maybe I won't see it in my lifetime, but I hope I encourage a number of people like yourself to take up the, you may come to different conclusions than me, but hopefully I've given you some structure to build upon and make sense of it all. There are always, you're never all the way in a journey, are you?
Right.
But, so yes, we shall reconvene.
Exactly. So how much time have we left? You said 10, 15 minutes?
Well, I've got to be in about 10 minutes. I've got to be somewhere else in 10 minutes.
Oh, in 10 minutes you ought to be somewhere else. Okay, so then we'll probably close the discussion at that point. And yeah, all right, awesome. So thanks a lot for coming on. It's been a great discussion. And next time we'll dive much deeper into the actual mechanisms that underlie clot formation, which is tightly linked to plaque formation, which is a very fascinating hypothesis, which, by the way, looking at all the different things that I have read in terms of LDL, heart disease, and atherosclerosis, up until that moment, that is the only thing that has made the most sense to me. And that's kind of the most important thing. Everything fits. And that's a philosophy that I find very compelling from your side, because you don't just say, okay, I come up with a model and it has to be right and I'm the god. You'd be like, okay, we have all these observations and they have to fit. Otherwise, the model cannot stand. It cannot be correct if it is not able to explain the observations. And that's what I love about your approach, because you actually take all these risk factors and all these observations and try to fit it into that model. And so that's a cool thing, and I applaud you for doing that.
Thank you very much. We will speak again.
Yes, absolutely. See you. See you soon.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.